Cool. Let's do this. All right. Thank you for coming. Just a little session here on what could be helpful for doing your connecting your database to your Windows Form application. What I'm going to do is basically take a database and connect it to a Windows Form application and show you some good ways to go about it to make these connections useful for you and how to manipulate your data. What I can't do, because it's an assessment, I can't help you with your D3 for that, so we're not showing you, I'm not going to show you the D3. It's actually got nothing to do with it. It's got nothing to do with the driving school. But hopefully what I explained to you today, you'll be able to transfer that knowledge into your D3. So basically what I'm going to show you is we're going to first talk about a design paradigm called MPC and explain to you why that is useful and why you use it and how to set it up. Then what we're going to do is connect the database and go through that process, and through the process of manipulating our data and how we work with this thing, hopefully you will see why sometimes it's, even though it's a little bit more work to set up, it might be better to work with your data if you need to select something and import it into your database somewhere else, or if you need to, rather than having to manipulate all your strings and everything. So let's just get started and sort of see where we go. So this acronym that I just said is MVC, okay? And basically that stands for Model View Controller. Okay, so we got to sort of see three sort of circles here, and basically, so we have the model, and that's the model is the interface with how C# represents the database. Okay, so if you have a look at your database, and you're going to create your tables, you'll have things like these things here. You have your columns, like your ID or your first name and your last name and whatever it is. And then you have your rows that have that data, right? So you have like 1, 2, 3, and then you have Bob, Jack, and go for that. This part here, okay, sort of your rows, they are your data, but your columns here are basically what you see when you create your EID. That becomes your what your table is called is your entity, and then those things are your properties effectively. So what we see in C# is when we create a class with the same name as your table or something close to it. And then the properties that we create by using get and set, those properties are going to resemble and map to the column headers that we there have inside our table. So that is our model. So if this model here, this table for example is called person, like that, right? And we would draw it out in an EID, we would have person like that. And from your EID, I know it's not quite the right shapes, but basically you have your ID, first name, last name, and then you have your cardinalities and all that sort of stuff that relates that to it. When we look at it from a C# point of view, hopefully that's going to show up right, otherwise I'll work something else out. When we look at it as a C# point of view, one thing that we've covered in class is how to create a UML diagram. So we create these diagrams, and we would have person as the name of the class, and then we have these properties where we would say what is an ID and a first name and a last name and all that sort of thing. From our UML diagram, that may or may not create methods depending what we're designing in for a class, although a model doesn't have those. From a UML diagram, we're able to code our C# class, okay? So when we create our C# class, we do something like public class person, and then the open bracket, and then we would do things like we do public string and then if name, and then you have these curly braces, which is my artistic talent here, with our get and our set. This is how we define our properties, okay? And so these properties are placeholders that map to a field that sits behind it, and that field basically gets the data from your database. So it's a model. We are modeling our database into a C# version of this, okay? So that's our model. We'll get back to that, and you'll see how that relates to in practice in a minute. The next thing that we have, okay, is our view. Our view is everything that we see and everything that's used to interact with your database. So where you place your buttons, your text boxes, anything that the user uses to interact with your program, that is considered a view. And so anything UI element, right, so those are your user interface elements, they are all placed in your view. And they basically then allow you to interact and say what data you want to display and when you want to get it, okay? So in terms of a website, your HTML and your CSS control what your view is. In terms of a Windows Forms application, it's basically everything that you visually see. So that represents your data or allows you to interact with it, okay? The third component, okay, is called your controller. So it's modeled for your controller. And your controller is the thing that does all the hard work. So when you click a button on your view, okay, and it needs to get data in from a database, your view goes to the controller. It says, I need this information. Your controller then goes to the model and with a database query sent up with it. And that model will then construct the data that it needs from the database. So your database sort of sits externally from your program. And then your model sends the information back to the controller so that the controller can put it back into the view. Okay? So one thing that you'll see that is actually not happening is that there is no interaction, no direct interaction between the model and the view, because the model is just there so that we have a C# interface to our database. Our view is there so that we can physically see what our program looks like. But the view doesn't directly interact with the model. The only way that the view can get to the model is by going through the controller. Okay? So I'm explaining that sort of like this, drawn out like that, so that when I jump between different folders, you'll see a little bit about what's going on. So with that in mind, and I'll redraw it and everything on the side there if I have to, basically we have Visual Studio here. Okay, so it's just an empty, you can just start a new project for that to work. Sorry, there you go. And if we have a look first, we have our SQL Server Management Studio. Okay, so this is the thing that you guys have used for SQL Server. I've connected to a database here. Let me just check if I'm still connected. So if we have a look here, we've got our database here in the left column. That should all be pretty straightforward. If you click down on tables, you can see we've created 4 tables: client, employee, product, and purchased. And we've got our tables in here, okay? So again, by far the complexity is not as complex as what you have to do sort of for your D3, but it should get the ideas across. So things like, they just have their properties, and sort of thing, and all of my tables, I've just for convention's sake, and just so we can see how everything relates, I've just prefixed them with TBL underscore. You don't have to do that, it's just so that I can see in my C# code when I'm dealing with what table very clearly. This last table, purchased, basically has just a also straightforward table, but it just has a couple of foreign keys in there, just so we can see how we deal with those. Okay, so those tables are made, and if I just have a quick look at if I need to add in any data, so we go that one and that one. So let me just see, so that's my people. Yeah, I think I've got data for everything. Cool. Alright, so basically that's all straightforward. We haven't done anything special in this. This is all as you would know it from your database class. And in our C# program, we've got a couple of folders created, okay? So these folders, they're just sort of placeholder folders. They're not going to affect how we access our files. It's just that we create that many C# files that if we have a bit of a structure to them, it will start to make a bit more sense. So as you can see, the folder that's currently selected there is our controller folder. I've got a folder for my models. I've got a folder for my views. But the first folder I'm going to open up is actually the setup folder. So this setup folder, okay, very short, it's got a connection.cs class file in there, and the only thing that this has is my connection string to my database, okay? So there is a class there called connection, then there's connection string, and that's just a property where I've hard-coded in my connection string, and every time I need my connection string, I pull this property into my other files. So that means that if I am changing, so my database is stored on Azure, so if I change my password to my database, I only need to do that in one place. If you move your database from your local machine here and you want to move it to another machine, or you want to move it to Azure, or the difference between what the Polytech setup is at home and at home is that here we use Microsoft SQL Server, like the developer edition, and at home you might have the SQL Express version. So all those little things, they affect what your data string, connection string is, what it's going to look like. So it's really handy just to have this in one place, and that's why I've got it here set up as a property. And so every time I call it, whenever I need to make different connections, I call this property rather than having to write out that connection string all the time, okay? So that's the only thing that's here in my setup folder. The SQL folder, that's just my database, so that's just my SQL file. That's exactly the thing that we've seen before, so not going to go through that one. The next thing, what we're going to do is we're just going to have a quick look at the models here. So these models, you can see here that I've got client, employee, product, and purchased. So those pretty much now match what we have in terms of our tables. And these files here, if I just close this connection string, they are literally one class with a bunch of properties in them, okay? So we've got our namespace at the top, then we have our class, in this case called clients, and all those properties that you see there, again, they don't hold any data, they just map to the things that we have in our table. So our client table here, as you can see, if we have a look at the structure at the top, we have ID, F name, L name, email, phone, address, street, city, suburb, postcode, so these things. And what we're mapping is basically the names, so that when we are referring to something in C# that it matches it in the in your database table, and the data type. We don't need to worry about the length of our varchars and things like that. It's just the type. So varchar is mapped to a string. Ints are ints. You can do floats and dates and all that sort of stuff. But when you match your model and you have a look, we are pretty much got just strings instead of varchars, okay? So varchars is just mapped to the database equivalent of string. So that's what our models look like. So if we have a look at employee, you'll see that very similar. Product, again, very similar. And purchased. And so one thing that you might notice once I've pointed it out, is that PID and CID in the database are being used as foreign keys. But in our C# code, we are not going to reference them as foreign keys specifically. So when we make our SQL query, they are still going to be recognized and used as foreign keys, but we don't need to do anything special in terms of how we define our properties for that. So just a normal model as we have here, okay? So we're going to come back to this model quite a bit, but that's just how we have these files set up here. The next thing, which I'll just show you what these look like, are our controllers and how they work, and we'll go back through them as we go into our view when we interact with these different things. So the first thing is that we have this SQL.cs file. This is the file that you have been given through from Waikato, okay? And pretty much nothing has changed. I've taken out, it's just got those two methods in there, one that executes a query and one that does a select query. The only thing that I have changed is that these methods were both of type void, and they will work like that. But I've changed this one to return an integer, and this one to actually return the SQL data reader object. And the reason being is that as a void method, they will still do the job, but they won't return you any data. Okay, so it's just a void. You click a button, it happens. If you pass in your data, it's fine. And if it didn't work, your program just crashes, and you have to kind of figure out why it crashes. So in advanced programming, if you do that class, one thing that I've made quite clear is that it's always better to have methods where we return data rather than just using void methods, regardless of whether they do the job. The other thing that I've made clear, which wasn't really built into these methods as such, is that we have no UI elements in our methods. Okay, so these methods here are free from UI elements. So whether I'm making a console app or a Xamarin app or a Windows Form app, I can use the same class. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So we'll see why we are dealing with returning of numbers and the returning of the SQL data reader. But basically, what this allows you to do is just by changing these two types of how these methods are, is that we are actually able to use this data rather than having to recreate these methods every time we do something different. So if we have a method here and it's just a void method and I want to make another query, I can pass in the string and that's fine. But with the SQL query, I have to put in all the logic of how I'm going to deal with that data coming back from my database. And by returning the SQL reader object, I can do that somewhere else in my controller. Okay? So this file we leave alone. We don't need to worry about it anymore. It's just so you know that those two methods are there to do what they to have the function. So one is still the reader for the select queries, and the other one is still the execute query for your insert, update, and delete statements. So if we have a look here at the client queries, what you'll basically see is that these queries that we have here, okay, so the employee query and product query and those things, they basically exist on the fact that we've got one select query, we've got an insert, we've got an update, and we've got a delete query, okay? So we basically have got the four CRUD methods in there. Now, when we think about this thing, is that when we create a model, it's a like-for-like model. So if we are, what I mean by that is that if we do a statement like select everything from a particular table, our model has all the properties in that it needs. And those properties are not specified in C# whether they are required or not. That's all dependent on our SQL table. But when we have a SQL table and we only want to return the, say, first name and last name column of that table, then what we need to do is we need to have a model that just has the first name and last name thing of our database. So this model, this query in our client matching model, this is based on the fact that we are selecting everything and putting everything into our program. And when we do an insert statement, we fill in all the fields and we push everything back to our database. Okay? So as you can see, my select query, very basic, select everything from table clients. If I want to do select if name from table clients, then I would have to create a new model with just an if name property, and I would have to create a new method inside of my query class to deal with that data. And still you might be thinking, yeah, that's a whole lot of work, but what's the benefit of this? Okay? We'll get to that. So the next thing is just to show you the employee class, same thing. Okay, so literally what I've done is just copy and paste and updated the different properties that I needed to update. So you can see that my list is here as referencing to my employee class instead of my client class. I'm doing select everything from table employee. I've updated this insert statement to match those properties and match this one and this one and this one. But you can see that we still have the 4 CRUD methods. The admin query one is the only one that's slightly different, because I only need to check if the username that I'm logging in as is in fact an admin person, but I don't need to update anything in my admin part as well. If I create an application where I am going to create users, update and delete users, then I can put them into this class as well. Okay, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. Purchases, let's just see. Mostly the same. This is just a list here that has some static values in for a combo list. But other than that, we still have our CRUD method. So one of the things is that MVC allows you, if you do it right, it allows you just the model and the controller both don't include any user interface objects. There is no label.txt, there is no integers here, there is no values preset in the model and the controller. And the reason being is that they can then be used in multiple platforms. Okay, our views make it platform specific. So all of our lists, so if we have here a list of payment options, for example, okay, we have a list, it's got a property of get, we are returning a list with just FPOS cash and credit card, and that will give us a list of the payment options that you'll see in the application in a minute. But because we're returning it as a list, if we now create an application in a different platform, we can use that same list without having to change any code. So I'll just have a look here through our view. So if you have a look here in the admin form, you'll see here that we've got an application with a menu bar at the top. We've got a username and a password, a text field login button, and all that sort of stuff. And so this is all things that similar to what you have seen. It just depends on how you set it up. And if we have a look at the code behind file, which you can do by just either tapping F7 or right-clicking on that little triangle and having that file underneath. Basically, you come to the C# code that sits and links directly to your user interface file. So in this file, which is our code behind file, you see that we are declaring labels, you are seeing that we are changing and calling other forms and doing all of that stuff. So my model, my controller, and my view are actually on very separate files, and so that's how they go from one to the next. So if we have a quick look at what this application is, okay, we run this application and it starts up with a login screen, and this menu bar, maybe hard to see, but that's grayed out, so that's disabled. I can't currently click on this menu and do anything with it, okay? So I'll just type in as a user there, and I click login. And As you can see, when I click login, it's gone and made our SQL query. So that's run here at the bottom. And that query says, well, that user exists in the database. So now I've disabled that and disabled the button because you are logged in. Our menu is now enabled, so I can go through that. And it says here that I'm logged in as admin, as it says at the title bar as well. So if I click here on select a form, I can select a client. And what I've done is I've displayed our data in several different ways. So one of them is a data grid, and I know you can't use one for D3, but it's still handy to have that code as a reference for you, okay? Then we have a list of clients, okay? So we'll go, if you click on that, you know you can display them differently, but I've just put everything into a single string. Then we have our add client, which deals with our insert new data into our database. So these are just text fields here that are, and then when we click on add client, it calls the insert function. So I'll show you in a bit where that is going. And then when I click on update and delete, I have a list box. Okay, so here I've got a list box with a bunch of just random generated names. And so if I click on Frank here, I can either change his name to Billy like that, and click update client, and you saw that Frank changed it to Billy. And also if I click on one of these BAs here, I can click on delete and it just removes it from the list, okay? So these things here, they all the data that you see is from the database, and so none of that is hard-coded in the application anywhere. So basically this little application is just the admin side of it. So we can create a customer if you might do a phone order or something like that. So that just tabs us to the data, to the tab that we saw in the client form, but it just highlights this add client section straight away. If I want to search for a product, I can do that. If I want to check, if I want to make a purchase, I can do that too. Let me just... Yeah, you guys will get the code to this at the end of it. So this little interface here, we'll just see what the items are that are in there. Okay, all the clients that are in there, we can set the client quantity. And so if I want to make a purchase of these things, okay, so these are just random generated names from generatedata.com. So they just randomly put letters together. Okay, it might be Welsh, something like that. Some of these are quite unpronounceable, I do know. Okay, so if we just click a user here, like that, we have Ben Farmer. This is the person that we selected in our list. He's buying some Bibidums, and he's buying 2, and that's his purchase date. And then we've got in the drop-down list, we have our list of the method that he's paying for. Okay, so we can make a purchase, and purchase successful, and then go from there. We can then go to return a purchase, and then we can see that Ben is able to return an item, which we will get to later on. So that's a little bit of the overview of the application as such, and where the different files are. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at these methods and see how they are constructed in the C# code, okay? So the best way to sort of start is, if we start with the client, we have our client here, okay? We can just click on these things so we can just recap what it looks like. So that we're working with this little form here, and the cool thing, and then we have our code behind file, which is F7, and we can just see that we are loading 3 methods, and then there's another constructor there, and so we have some methods, and we have our events. Now events and methods look very similar, okay, and they're easily confused, but they need to actually be separated for what we want to do. So when we do an event, okay, an event is like I click on a button, that's an event of the application, and you can recognize that we've got an event, and when you double click on an item, and it will have this object sender, comma, event args space E, okay? So those are just the two arguments that C# puts into the Visual Studio puts in the C# code, so that it can recognize what button is being pressed and what method, what details it needs from that. So an event is not a normal method, okay? We can't add, for example, we can't take a button, go comma, and then go string, and then go if name, and pass in another parameter. In this case, it won't come up with an error because technically it's correct code, but you can't actually pass in another parameter when you do a button click method. It doesn't know how to pass it through. So the way to get around that, okay, is that we create a method which we've done at the top, which is up here, these things. And these methods are like load my data grid, load my list box, reload, no, those are events, and the get data one. Okay, so these ones here, we basically have three methods that we deal with, and from that we call things in different controllers. So when we have a look at this data list box, okay, basically what we do is we have a variable there called get data. We call our class client queries, which is in our controller folder up there. And inside our client queries, we have a method there called display clients in lists. Okay? So if we hover over this var over here, we can see that C# will tell us what kind of variable this is. So it will be systems.collection.generic list. So we're not dealing with a string. We're not getting anything back like a data type that we can just print straight away. It comes to us as a list. And the reason why it comes to us as a list is because in our controller, if we open that up, we have over here our select query, where we have we call in our SQL class, and then we have the .select query string. So that's the second method that's in our SQL class. And we're passing in our SQL query that we want. And from in here, from our controller class, we go through this data reader part, okay? So rather than creating another method in our SQL class, what we're actually doing, is we're just returning the list back from our database, from that SQL class, and we put all the data reader stuff into this class here. And the reason why we do that is so that if we have different SQL queries that we need to run, we don't need to touch that SQL class. We just call it and pass in the query and deal with these bits here. That is the first reason. The second reason is that here we can create a list based on our client model. And so this list, every time we add a new item to our list, it creates a new instance of this class where we are where we need to use these properties. So here we've got clients.add. Clients is our list up the top here, and every time we go through this loop, it adds a new instance of class. So clients, the new clients is a new instance of a class, and every time we add a new instance of a class, we are referring to the ID, the first name, the last name, and the email, and the other properties, the address properties and stuff that are there. The bits here that you see is that dr is our data reader variable. So I've just called it up here. Remember, this select query string is returning a data reader. So our variable here is hovering over, if we hover over this, we can see that we are actually, that the dr variable is actually a system.data.sql client.sql data reader. So that's a SQL data reader object. And so that dr holds these values of the ID, F name, L name, and email address, etc., which is these things here, okay, inside of our data reader. they match what we have here inside of our database. So that's the sort of pattern that comes in. Now, when we use a list, we are then able to put bits and pieces of a list into another string. We can add two values of data together, all doing that in C#, okay? The idea is that our database holds the data, but it doesn't do any programming work. You can add some stuff to it, like you can do some calculations and stuff in SQL, but if we can do that stuff in C#, that's what that language is built for, as opposed to what SQL is built for. So we create this list of clients, or display all clients in a list, and if we were to run the display all clients, we can see, we can then access those properties and get these values. So if we have a little question? Stretch. Alright, we'll have a break soon, if it helps. So when we have a look at a list, okay, so we have, so var, I'm just going to call it C new clients, okay, and that's our class, whoops. That's the class that we have, and then we do go through that loop where we add our data into it, and then we can do things like C, where we have our index of our array or of our list, and then we can go .ifName or .lname or whatever the name is of the properties that are represented in our model. Okay, so that those are basically these things here. So these things here match what we have in our model, and then we can access these this data anywhere else. So the advantage of this is that if you use the method in the SQL class as a void method, and you just make just change it so it prints something or it creates a string, that string is then a string for the remainder of the application. If you want to change that, you have to go through that process of adding and making a whole another method and going through that process. Whereas now I have this class with new clients, and I can now create another string, okay, and I can do something like this, where we have ifName and plus C square bracket 0 lname, and I can choose that option inside of my C# code. I don't need to preset that anywhere else in my SQL classes. I can actually manipulate that somewhere else. So this is basically then saying is that once I've got this, okay, once I've got this and I want to go to another list, I can choose which objects I want to display. And so that's the sort of thinking that sits behind it. And so we've talked about models in advanced programming in the class as well. We've talked about models and classes and how we add those things into lists. And those lists are basically powerful. When we talked about SQLite and JSON, we use these models and things as well. So that's sort of thing that we've done that quite a bit. Now, once we do this, if we run this application and now have a look at that again, basically here, logging in as ReMC, and hopefully we go logged in. And so if I click my client form, this data grid, okay, it uses that list, that same list, to display the data in here, okay. This list here uses that same list to display the data in here. Whether we split that up or whether we put it together, it doesn't matter. This add client form, okay, that uses the same class to that same model to add stuff to your database. This update and delete uses the same model, uses the same controller, uses the same interface in the model to update this data. So all of a sudden, we get a bit of a design paradigm where we are actually getting our data in from SQL in a single way, but we can use it in any way that we want. And so a lot of the problems that have come up when people have asked me questions is that I'm getting a string back from my database. How can I just have this portion display that? Or how can I pre-populate the field when I have all of this data? How can I just pre-populate it with just that part? I just want to pass in the first name or the last name, or I just want to pass in a phone number or a make of a car or something. And if you have solid strings every single time, you're going to have to break those strings apart. Whereas if we use these models, then you can sort of select that and be more specific about it. Okay? So if we have a look through here, so we'll have a bit of a break for about 10 minutes, so I can have some water and not crack my vocal cords. And we can do some questions and point them into different directions, all right? So we'll go through that, and then we'll come back to this in a bit.